The light from my phone screen was the only thing holding back the gray November gloom in my small Cleveland apartment. It cast long shadows across the worn floral pattern of the armchair, the one my late husband, Tom, always said had molded itself perfectly to his back. Now, it just felt too big for me. On the screen, 1,000 miles away in Austin, Texas, my daughter Jessica was practically glowing. She stood on a stage bathed in a soft, expensive blue light, holding a sleek glass award that looked like a shard of frozen lightning. The banner behind her read, "Innovate for Good," and the crowd was a sea of tailored suits and elegant dresses, their applause echoing tinny and distant through my phone's tiny speaker. I held the phone in one hand, my fingers tracing the spiderweb of cracks across the top of the screen, and used my other to spoon tomato soup from a chipped bowl. It was the good kind, the one that's $1.50 a can instead of 99 cents, my little treat for the week. Jess looked beautiful. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look serious and important, and the dress she wore was the color of a deep red wine, the kind of thing you see on movie stars. Her husband, Liam, stood just off stage, his smile so wide and proud it looked like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He caught the camera for a second, and his eyes had that familiar, polished glint, the look of a man who is always calculating the exact value of the room he's in. Jess stepped up to the microphone, her voice trembling just enough to sound humble. "Wow, the Ethical Innovator of the Year award. I'm speechless." The crowd laughed warmly. My company, Viridia, was built on a simple principle, that success is meaningless unless you lift up the people who first lifted you. And no one lifted me higher than my mother, Carol. My spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. My heart gave a painful little lurch. She never talked about me like that, not in public. Not since, well, not in a long time. I could feel a blush of pride warming my cheeks, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost felt like a fever. "She's watching from home in Cleveland tonight," Jess continued, her voice catching with emotion. "She was a nurse's aide for 30 years, a woman who held the hands of strangers and worked double shifts so I could have a shot at a life she never did." The camera zoomed in on her face, catching a single, perfect tear as it traced a path down her cheek. And that's why, when we founded Viridia, the first promise I made to myself was that she would never have to worry again. It's the greatest privilege of my life to provide her with a $10,000 a month legacy stipend so she can finally live the rest of her life in the comfort and dignity she gave to so many others. The applause was deafening. It roared through my phone, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to suck all the air out of my little apartment. $10,000 a month. The number didn't compute. It was an alien figure, a string of zeros that had no place in my world of past due notices and bargain bin groceries. I looked from the phone screen to the yellow envelope sitting on my counter, the final warning from the electric company, its bold red letters practically screaming at me. I thought of the cleaning rags soaking in my sink, ready for my midnight shift at the office building downtown. I thought of the school bus I'd be monitoring in the morning, the squeal of its brakes, a constant reminder of how far I was from any kind of comfort. The pride that had warmed me just a moment before turned instantly to ice. A cold, heavy dread pooled in my stomach, so intense it felt like I'd swallowed a stone. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance. I was a character in a play I hadn't known I was cast in, my name and my life story being used as set dressing for my daughter's grand, ethical stage. As the applause died down, Jess blew a kiss to the camera, but it was Liam's face that caught my attention. He was clapping along with everyone else, but for a split second, his eyes met the camera lens, and his polished smile tightened at the edges. It wasn't pride I saw. It was the cool, satisfied look of a craftsman admiring a piece of furniture he'd just finished building. A well-made, sturdy lie. He knew I was watching. And in that look, I felt a silent, chilling message. Your life is our story now, and you will play your part. The lie was not just for them. It was a cage being built around me, and I was just now beginning to feel its bars. What they didn't know was that a woman who has spent 30 years cleaning up other people's messes learns a thing or two about finding the dirt everyone else tries to hide. And my daughter had just made the biggest mess of her life. The applause from Austin didn't fade until I finally fell into a restless sleep around 2 a.m., my daughter's smiling face floating behind my eyelids. When my alarm clock blared at 5:30, the sound felt like a physical blow, dragging me back to a world where there were no glass awards, only the piercing, gray Cleveland dawn. The apartment was cold, the kind of damp, persistent cold that gets into your bones and reminds you the heating bill is another monster you have to fight every month. I stood at the counter and dunked the same tea bag I'd used yesterday into a mug of hot water, watching the weak color bleed into it. On the counter, the yellow envelope from the county treasurer seemed to glow with a sickly light. Final notice: delinquent property tax. The words were a threat, a promise that this small space, the only thing left of my life with Tom, could be taken away. $10,000 a month. The thought was a bitter laugh that caught in my throat. That amount would pay off this notice, the mortgage, and the leaky faucet under the sink, with enough left over to fill my pantry for a year. Instead, it was just a ghost, a pretty number used to win a trophy. By 6:45, I was at the bus depot, the air smelling of diesel fumes and damp asphalt. My route was the middle school one, a rolling box of hormonal energy and shouted conversations. I walked the aisle, my worn boots squeaking on the rubber floor, and did my head count. "Sit down, Michael." "No, you cannot throw that." "Sarah, feet out of the aisle." I was the monitor, the invisible authority figure they were paid to ignore. As the bus rattled over potholes, each jolt sent a sharp pain through my lower back. I leaned my head against the cold window, watching the brick houses of Cleveland slide by, their windows dark and sleepy. In Austin, Jess was probably waking up in a king-sized bed with high thread count sheets, the glass award gleaming on her nightstand. Did she even remember the words she'd said? Or were they just part of a script, lines she'd rehearsed until they sounded like the truth? The thought was a small, sharp piece of glass in my chest. The stipend wasn't real, but the lie was. And the lie was meant to make her look good while I sat here on a rumbling bus, feeling like a fool. After the route, I stopped at the discount grocery store, the one with the flickering fluorescent lights and dented cans. My list was short because my wallet was thin. A loaf of day-old bread, a can of tuna, 2 potatoes, and a small carton of milk. At the checkout, the total came to $7.42. I counted out the wrinkled bills and the collection of coins from my pocket, my fingers stiff from the cold. The young cashier barely looked at me, her eyes already on the next person in line. In that moment, I had never felt more invisible. I was just an old woman in a patched coat, buying just enough food to get through the next 2 days. How could Jess stand on that stage and paint a picture of me living in comfort and dignity when my dignity was measured in loose change at a discount grocery store? It wasn't just a lie, it was a theft. She had stolen my reality and replaced it with a fantasy that served only her. Back in my apartment, I put the meager groceries away and sat at my small kitchen table. I took out the yellow envelope again and stared at the amount I owed. $2,800. An impossible sum. I'd been trying to scrape together a few extra dollars every week, taking extra cleaning shifts, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a leaky thimble. My husband Tom had worked at the steel mill for 40 years to pay for this house. He'd come home every night, covered in a fine layer of grime, his hands calloused and strong. He believed in the simple math of a hard day's work for a fair day's pay. What would he think of this new math, where a person's life could be turned into a tax write-off and a talking point? I traced his faded signature on an old photograph, the comforting loop of his T. My legacy wasn't a stipend, it was this house. It was the memory of a good man. And I was going to lose it because my own daughter was using me as a prop in her perfect, polished life. That evening, as I got ready for my cleaning shift, the despair began to burn off, leaving something harder and hotter in its place. I pulled on my worn blue coveralls and looked at my reflection in the hall mirror. My face was tired, etched with lines that told the story of 1,000 night shifts and 1,000,000 small worries. But my eyes were clear. They weren't the eyes of a confused old woman. They were the eyes of a nurse's aide who knew how to spot a lie just by the way a person's breathing changed. They were the eyes of a bus monitor who could see trouble brewing at the back of the bus before a single punch was thrown. As I locked the door to my apartment, the cold night air hit my face, but for the first time all day, I didn't shiver. The Cleveland cold was a familiar ache, an old friend. But the coldness from Austin, that was a betrayal. And as I walked toward the bus stop, the city lights blurring around me, I knew I couldn't just let it sit. I had to face it. I had to make a phone call. I had to hear the lie from her own mouth. The office building I cleaned was a ghost ship after midnight. A silent 20-story tower of glass and steel, where the only sounds were the hum of the servers and the soft squeak of my cart's wheels on the polished marble floors. It was on my 15-minute break, sitting in a sterile white break room under lights that were always too bright, that I finally made the call. My hands were chapped and red from the cleaning chemicals, and I had to wipe them on my coveralls before I could unlock my phone. My heart was thumping a hard, steady rhythm against my ribs, a drummer calling troops to a battle I wasn't sure I was ready for. I scrolled to Jess's contact and pressed the screen. It rang 4 times, each tone stretching into an eternity. I imagined it ringing in her beautiful Austin home, a pleasant, melodic sound interrupting a life of curated success. "Mom, hi." Her voice was bright, almost unnaturally cheerful, like she was performing for an audience I couldn't see. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses and soft music in the background. "Is everything okay? It's a little late there." I took a breath and kept my own voice as level as I could. "I'm fine, honey. I'm on my break. I I was watching the awards ceremony online earlier. You looked wonderful. The award is very impressive." "Oh, thank you. It was such a whirlwind. Liam is so proud. We just got back from a celebratory dinner." She paused, and for a moment I thought she might say something real. But the moment passed. "So what's up?" Here it was, the moment of truth. "Jess, in your speech, you said you were giving me a stipend, $10,000 a month." I said the number out loud, and it felt absurd, like a line from a movie. I was confused. I've never received anything like that. There was a beat of silence on her end. Not a confused silence, but a calculating one. I could practically hear the gears turning. Then, a light, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Mom, you're so funny. It's not like a paycheck. It's a long-term investment strategy." Liam set it all up. In the background, I heard a man's muffled whisper. Liam. He was right there, feeding her the lines. "I don't understand," I said, my voice getting a little firmer. The lie was so blatant, so insulting. "An investment strategy doesn't pay my property taxes, Jess. The notice came last week. I could lose the house." "See, this is why we handle it for you," she said, her bright tone now laced with impatience. "It's a portfolio, Mom, an investment vehicle designed for long-term growth. We're building you a nest egg. You don't see the cash month to month because it's being reinvested. It's much more complex than just a simple bank deposit. Liam says the tax implications alone are..." I cut her off. The corporate jargon was a wall she was trying to build between us, and I refused to let her finish it. "Jessica, stop. Stop talking to me like I'm one of your shareholders. I was a nurse's aide. I know what a dollar is. My bank account is overdrawn. Is there a real account with my name on it that has real money in it, yes or no?" The line went quiet again. I could hear Liam's voice, louder this time, sharp and annoyed. "Just tell her it's being managed." Jess came back on, her voice strained. "It's being managed, Mom, for your own good. You just have to trust us. You're getting older, and these things can be, well, they can be confusing." That was it. That was the knife. The casual, condescending suggestion that my mind was failing me, that my reality wasn't real. The anger that had been simmering all day finally boiled over, hot and clean. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury I hadn't felt in years. "Don't you dare talk to me about being confused. I know the difference between being cared for and being used as a tax deduction. I know the smell of bleach on my own hands at 1 in the morning. Is any of that confusing to you?" Suddenly, the phone was snatched away. Liam's voice, stripped of all warmth, was a blade in my ear. "Carol, this conversation is over." It was the first time in years he hadn't called me Mom. Jess is a public figure. Viridia is a respected brand. We have a responsibility to protect our family's image from unnecessary drama. Whatever financial confusion you're experiencing, you need to handle it quietly. Do not make this a problem for us. It wasn't a request. It was an order, a threat. Before I could even form a response, he'd hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, loud and mocking in the silent break room. I slowly lowered the phone, my hand trembling. He hadn't just dismissed me, he had threatened me. "Handle it quietly. Don't make it a problem." My entire life, my home, my struggles, my very real fear of losing everything had just been reduced to an inconvenient piece of family drama that might tarnish their precious brand. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, overlooking the sleeping city. I saw a woman in blue coveralls, her face pale with exhaustion and rage. They thought she was weak. They thought she was confused. They thought a single sharp threat would be enough to make her disappear back into the shadows they'd written for her. But as I looked into my own eyes, I saw something else flicker to life. It wasn't confusion. It was war. I don't remember finishing my shift that night. I must have pushed the cart, emptied the trash, wiped down the endless countertops, but my body was just an automaton running on muscle memory. My mind was a silent, ringing space where Liam's words echoed like a verdict. Don't make this a problem for us. When I finally stepped out of the building into the pre-dawn chill, the sky was the color of a deep bruise. I didn't go home to my empty apartment. I walked the 2 blocks to a 24-hour diner, a little place called Gus's, where the coffee was strong and the vinyl on the booth seats was cracked like an old road map. I slid into a booth, the smell of bacon and stale coffee wrapping around me like a familiar blanket, and I called the only person in the world I knew would understand. Brenda arrived 20 minutes later, her short gray hair still a little wild from sleep, her sensible coat buttoned up to her chin. She'd been my best friend through 30 years of bedpans, double shifts, and holding the hands of grieving families at the county hospital. She saw the truth of a situation with the sharp, unsentimental clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. She took one look at my face as she slid into the booth opposite me, flagged down the waitress, and ordered 2 black coffees before I could even open my mouth. She waited until the thick ceramic mugs were on the table, steaming between us, before she spoke. "Okay, Carol," she said, her voice low and steady. "Tell me everything, and don't you dare leave out the parts that make you feel foolish." So I did. I told her about the awards ceremony, the perfect tear on Jess's cheek, and the impossible number that had been attached to my name. I told her about the yellow envelope on my counter, the dented cans in my pantry, and the ache in my back that never quite went away. And then I told her about the phone call. I recounted the corporate doublespeak, the condescending tone, and Liam's final, icy threat. As I spoke, I felt a hot wave of shame wash over me. Saying it all out loud made it feel real, and it made me feel small, like a child being scolded for misunderstanding the adult world. Brenda listened without a single interruption. She just wrapped her hands around her warm mug, her knuckles white, and her dark eyes never left my face. Her gaze wasn't pitying. It was furious. When I finished, the silence in the diner seemed to rush in to fill the space my words had left. Brenda took a slow sip of her coffee and placed the mug down with a firm, deliberate click. "Carol Sullivan," she said, and the way she used my full name made me sit up straighter. "I've seen you calm down a panicked family after a 5-car pileup. I've watched you calculate drip rates in your head in the middle of a code blue. I've seen you work a 16-hour shift and then go home to sit with Tom through his chemo without a single complaint. In all the years I have known you, I have seen you tired, I have seen you grieving, and I have seen you angry. But not one single time have I ever seen you confused." The word hung in the air between us. Confused. The weapon they had tried to use against me. Brenda leaned forward, her eyes flashing with the righteous fire I'd seen her turn on incompetent doctors and dismissive administrators for decades. "Confusion is a diagnosis, Carol. It has symptoms. It shows up on a chart. It is a medical fact, not an insult someone gets to throw at you when their lies get inconvenient. What they're giving you isn't concern for your memory. It's disrespect. It's fraud. They are stealing your life story to sell their brand, and they are stealing your money or the money they claim is yours to line their own pockets. This isn't family drama. This is elder abuse." Her words hit me with the force of a physical shock. Elder abuse. She had named the monster. She had taken the vague, shadowy shame I was feeling and exposed it to the harsh, sterile light of a diagnosis. It wasn't me who was sick. It was the situation. It wasn't my mind that was failing. It was their morality. Everything they had said, the condescending tone, the talk of portfolios, Liam's threat, it all clicked into place. It was a strategy. A deliberate effort to make me small, to make me quiet, to make me doubt my own reality so they could continue with theirs. I looked down at my own hands resting on the cool Formica tabletop. They were the hands of a worker. Knuckles a little swollen, skin dry, but they were strong. They had held newborns, and they had held the dying. They had balanced checkbooks down to the last penny. They knew what was real. I looked up and met Brenda's fierce, loyal gaze. A single hot tear slid down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness or shame. It was a tear of pure, clarifying rage. "You're right," I whispered, my voice thick but steady. "You're right, Bren. I'm not confused." I took a deep, shuddering breath and felt a lifetime of being quiet and agreeable fall away. And I'm not going to be quiet anymore. The decision to fight back felt like a fire in my chest that night, a clean, bright flame burning away the fog of shame and confusion. But a fire needs fuel, and as I pushed my cleaning cart through the deserted hallways of the accounting firm on the 14th floor, I felt the first pangs of a new kind of helplessness. Brenda's words had given me a direction, but I had no map. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the proof I needed wasn't in Cleveland, it was in Austin. And it was hidden in a world I didn't understand, a digital world of databases and online records that felt as distant and impenetrable as a foreign country. I'm from a generation that balanced checkbooks with a pencil and a prayer. My phone was a tool for calls and the occasional text, not a key to unlock sophisticated financial lies. The fire of my resolve was burning bright, but I was terrified it would burn out before I could find any kind of kindling. It was almost 3 a.m. when I saw him. Marco, the night security guard, was sitting at his post in the main lobby, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop. He was a good kid, maybe 25, always with a polite nod and a quiet "Have a good night, Carol," when my shift ended. He was usually watching videos or playing some kind of game, but tonight he was scrolling through a website that looked dense with text and charts. An idea, half-formed and terrifying, began to take shape in my mind. I was a proud woman. I'd spent my life being the one who offered help, not the one who asked for it. But pride, I was quickly learning, was a luxury I could no longer afford. My hands felt clammy as I pushed my cart toward his desk, the wheels making a soft, rhythmic squeak that sounded impossibly loud in the silent lobby. He looked up, a little startled, and quickly minimized his screen. "Hey, Carol, everything okay?" "I'm fine, Marco. I have a strange question." I leaned against my cart, trying to look casual, but I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. "You're good with computers, right?" He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "I get by. What's up?" I took a breath. "Let's say you wanted to find out who owned a piece of property, a building or a house, but you didn't want to ask anyone directly. Could you find that out on there?" I nodded toward his laptop. His brow furrowed with curiosity. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I think he saw something in my eyes beyond a simple, strange question. He saw the exhaustion and the fear and the fire underneath it all. "Yeah, usually," he said slowly, pulling his laptop closer. "Most property records are public. You just need to know where to look. You go to the county assessor's website for whatever county the property is in. Why? You thinking of buying a place?" "Something like that," I lied, the word feeling clumsy in my mouth. "It's in Austin, Texas." "Travis County, then," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. In seconds, he had a web page on the screen that looked official and intimidating. "See? Travis County Appraisal District. You can search by address or by owner's name." He paused. "What if the owner isn't a person, though? What if it's a company?" His question was so direct, so close to the heart of what I feared, that it took my breath away. "Companies own houses?" "All the time," Marco said, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely engaged, like a teacher finding a student who was actually interested. "They set up these things called LLCs, limited liability companies. It's a way to protect their personal assets, but most of those are public records too. You just have to search the state's business registry." He typed again and pulled up another site. "Texas Secretary of State. You can look up any registered business right here. It'll tell you who the registered agent is, when it was formed, the official address." I stared at the screen, at the search bars and the official seals. It was a new language, a new world, but for the first time it didn't feel impenetrable. It felt like a door that had just been unlocked. He had just handed me a key. Marco must have seen the look on my face, because his voice softened. "Carol, if you're in some kind of trouble, with a landlord or something, there are people who can help." I felt a lump form in my throat. This kind young man, a near stranger, was showing me more genuine concern than my own daughter had. I shook my head, managing a small, watery smile. "Thank you, Marco. This is more help than you know. I can take it from here." He looked like he wanted to ask more, but he respected my privacy. He simply nodded and wrote the names of the 2 websites on a sticky note. "Just be careful what you go clicking on," he said. "And if you get stuck, you know where I am." I took the small yellow square of paper from him. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with possibility. As I pushed my cart back toward the elevators, the fire in my chest burned with a new kind of fuel. It wasn't just rage anymore, it was hope. I had an ally, I had a map. And as I rode the elevator up to the 15th floor, the little yellow sticky note clutched in my hand, I knew exactly where I was going as soon as the sun came up. The Cleveland Public Library. My war wasn't going to be fought with phone calls and tears. It was going to be fought with paper trails and public records. And it was just getting started. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that day. As soon as I got home from my shift, I washed my face, changed out of my coveralls, and put on the nicest blouse I owned, a faded blue one that Brenda always said matched my eyes. It felt important, somehow, to look respectable, like I belonged. I was about to walk into a place of knowledge, and I wanted to do it as Carol Sullivan, not just as the woman who cleaned its floors. The Cleveland Public Library is a grand old building, a palace of sandstone and marble, with high cathedral-like ceilings that make you feel like you should be whispering. It had always been a sanctuary for me, a place where the world went quiet and you could lose yourself in stories. But today, I wasn't there to escape my story. I was there to find it. I found an empty computer carrel in a quiet corner, the dark wood cool and solid beneath my hands. The librarian, a kind woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, helped me log in. I felt a pang of insecurity, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard as I stared at the bright, clean screen. This was their world, Jess and Liam's. Fast, digital, and unforgiving. I took the little yellow sticky note from my pocket and smoothed it out on the desk. Marco's handwriting was a comforting, solid presence. I took a deep breath and letter by letter typed in the first address, the website for the Texas Secretary of State. The site was a maze of official-looking links and legal jargon. For 20 minutes, I felt like I was back in the dark, clicking on the wrong things, getting lost in pages of corporate tax law that made my head spin. I almost gave up, the old feeling of being foolish, and out of my depth creeping back in. But then I saw Brenda's face in my mind, her eyes flashing with righteous anger. I have never seen you confused. I closed my eyes, took another breath, and started over, this time moving more slowly. I found the search bar for business organizations and started typing. I tried Jess's name, then Liam's. Nothing that seemed right. Then I remembered the way Liam's smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he looked like a man who enjoyed the cleverness of his own secrets. What were his initials? Liam Morgan. LM I typed in, LM Holdings. Nothing. LM Investments. Nothing. Then I tried LM Creative. Bing. A single result appeared on the screen. LM Creative Holdings, LLC. My heart leaped into my throat. The name was so bland, so corporate, but seeing his initials there in black and white felt like a confession. I clicked on it. The details were all there, stark and official. The date of formation was just 2 weeks after Jess's company, Viridia, had announced its first major round of venture capital funding 2 years ago. The registered agent was listed as Liam Morgan. And the mailing address was the same glittering downtown Austin high-rise that housed Viridia's corporate headquarters. There was no separation. It was all the same beast. My hands were shaking now, but I wrote everything down in the small notebook I'd brought, my handwriting neat and steady from years of filling out medical charts. Next, I took the name of the LLC and opened the second website Marco had given me, the Travis County Appraisal District. My fingers flew across the keyboard this time, driven by a new, terrible certainty. I typed LM Creative Holdings into the owner search. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the page refreshed. A single property was listed, Unit 18B, at a new luxury high-rise called the Azure. I clicked on the address. The screen filled with professional photographs of a place so beautiful it didn't look real. A kitchen with gleaming marble countertops, a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering curve of the Colorado River, a balcony with a small, elegant table for two. It was a palace in the sky. I scanned the property details, my eyes catching on the numbers. 2 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. Assessed value, $1.8 million, and then I saw the line that made the air freeze in my lungs. Sale date, 18 months ago, right around the time the stipend was supposed to have started. Sale price, confidential. Transaction type, cash sale. Cash, not a mortgage, not a loan, a single, clean transaction. A mountain of money had been moved at once, washed through a ghost company, and solidified into marble and glass and $1 million view. The sheer scale of the deception, the cold, calculated premeditation of it all, left me breathless. This wasn't just a lie to make Jess look good at a party. This was a sophisticated, long-term operation. This was a system designed to siphon money and I had a sickening feeling I knew where that money was coming from. My name, my story, my supposed legacy wasn't just a talking point. It was the foundation on which this palace in the sky had been built. I fumbled in my purse for the quarters I'd brought and walked on unsteady legs to the printing station. The whirring of the machine and the soft slide of the warm paper into the tray was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I printed everything: the business filing for the LLC, the property record for the condo, the tax history. I held the pages in my hand. It wasn't just a story in my head anymore. It wasn't a feeling or a suspicion. It was here, on paper. It was real, undeniable proof. As I gathered my things, the quiet sanctuary of the library no longer felt like a place of escape. It felt like an armory. I had my first weapons. Now, I just had to figure out how to get behind enemy lines to find the rest. The stack of papers I'd printed at the library sat on my kitchen table like a judge and jury. They told a story of corporate shells and real estate, a clean, bloodless crime committed in the language of lawyers and accountants. But I knew it wasn't enough. A good lawyer, and Liam would have the best, could explain it all away as a complex investment strategy. They would paint me as the confused old mother who saw malice in a spreadsheet she simply couldn't comprehend. I was missing the most important piece of the puzzle, the direct, undeniable line connecting their company's money to that ghost corporation. I needed to find the checks. And there was only one place in the world those would be. The decision was the hardest I'd ever made. I sat at the table and opened my bank's app on my phone. My balance was $642.18. It was my emergency fund, the money I'd scraped together penny by penny for a new water heater or a medical bill. It was the only safety net I had. A round-trip flight to Austin, even a last-minute one, would take almost all of it. The risk was enormous. If I went there and found nothing, I would be left with an empty bank account and an even emptier future. I looked at the yellow tax notice on my counter, then at the printed condo records. One was the threat of what I would lose. The other was the proof of what they had already stolen. I closed my eyes, took a breath that felt like it was tearing my lungs, and bought the ticket. The phone call to Jess was a performance that deserved its own Glass Award. I pitched my voice to sound a little lonely, a little wistful. "Hi, honey. I was just thinking, I haven't seen you in so long. I miss my girl. I was thinking I might just hop on a plane and come for a surprise visit this weekend." The silence on her end was thick with annoyance. "Oh, Mom, wow, that's so spontaneous. This weekend is really not a good time. Liam and I have the big Viridia team-building retreat on Saturday. We'll be gone all day and overnight." "Oh, that's no problem at all," I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like poison in my mouth. "I can let myself in and just putter around the house. It will be a relief to get out of this dreary Cleveland weather. I just want to see your beautiful home and maybe cook you a nice meal for when you get back on Sunday." I had cornered her. To refuse would be to admit she didn't want me there, a crack in the perfect facade of the loving daughter she'd just presented to the world. "Okay, Mom," she sighed, the sound of a CEO being forced to deal with a minor logistical inconvenience. "That sounds lovely. Just let me know when you land." 2 days later, I stepped out of the Austin airport into a wall of heat and humidity so thick it felt like I was breathing water. The sky was a vast, blinding blue, and the city hummed with a nervous, ambitious energy that made my teeth ache. Jess's house was in a neighborhood where the lawns were all perfectly manicured, and the houses were exercises in minimalist geometry, all glass and steel and sharp angles. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a corporate headquarters. I let myself in with the spare key she'd told me was under a potted cactus and stepped into a world of cool, conditioned air and stark white walls. There was a single, abstract painting in the foyer that probably cost more than my car. The silence was deafening. This was the house my legacy had bought. I knew from Jess that their housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, came on Saturdays. I waited until I heard her van pull up. Rosa was a small, quiet woman in her 50s with kind, tired eyes that had clearly seen more than they let on. I introduced myself, and her professional demeanor softened immediately when she heard I was Jess's mother. I made us both a cup of tea, and we sat at the huge marble island in the kitchen. I didn't tell her my story, but I didn't have to. I just treated her like a person. I asked about her children. I told her about my life as a nurse's aide. I saw in her a fellow traveler in the world of invisible work. After a while, I put on my most wistful expression. I said, pulling a small, worn photograph of a 5-year-old Jess from my wallet. "I brought this for her. I wanted to leave it as a surprise on her desk in the office." but the door is locked. Rosa looked from the photo to me, and a flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. She knew her employers. She knew the cool distance, the polite dismissals. She knew they weren't the kind of people who appreciated sentimental things. She simply nodded. "The office can get very dusty," she said quietly. "I have a key for the cleaning." A moment later, I was standing in their home office. It was as cold and impersonal as the rest of the house. A massive desk, 2 sleek chairs, and a wall of built-in shelves. There was no clutter, no personal photos, nothing to suggest real people worked here. My eyes scanned the desk, and there it was, a leather-bound checkbook sitting right next to the keyboard. My hands trembled as I reached for it. It was a Viridia corporate account. I flipped it open. The stubs were filled out in Liam's neat, sharp handwriting, paid to the order of LM Creative Holdings. My breath hitched. I flipped another page. LM Creative Holdings. And another. LM Creative Holdings. The memo lines were the final, brutal confirmation. Q2 Family Support. Legacy Stipend C. Sullivan. Parental Care Strategy. It was all there, a meticulous record of their crime. My gaze darted around the room, and I saw a single manila folder sitting in the desk's inbox tray, labeled simply, Family and Personal. My fingers felt numb as I opened it. On top was a letter, printed on heavy cream-colored paper. It was from a high-end accounting firm, addressed to Liam. I scanned the text. "Commend you on your innovative elder care support strategy. By structuring the payments to your mother-in-law through the holding company, you have maximized tax efficiency while providing her with long-term security." The words blurred. Maximized tax efficiency. I wasn't a mother, I was a tax efficiency. I pulled out my cracked phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. With a silent, desperate prayer, I started taking pictures. The check stubs, the accountant's letter, every page. The soft click of the phone's shutter sounded like a cannon blast in the silent house. I had to get this. This was everything. This was the proof that couldn't be explained away. As I photographed the last page of the letter, a sound from outside made me freeze, my blood turning to ice. It was the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A car door slammed shut. They were home. They were early. For a long, silent second, my entire body forgot how to move. The sound of the car door slamming shut was a gunshot that echoed in the tomb-like quiet of the house. My mind raced, a frantic scramble of pure, animal panic. The folder, the checkbook. My hands, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the papers, trying to slide the accountant's letter back into the manila folder, exactly as I'd found it. I nudged the checkbook back to its original position, my fingers leaving a faint, damp smudge on the cool leather. My phone felt like a hot coal in my hand. I shoved it deep into the pocket of my slacks, just as I heard the front door of the house open, and the sound of my daughter's laughter light and carefree drifted down the hallway. My back was to the door of the office. I snatched the small, worn photo of 5-year-old Jess from the desk, holding it like a shield. I tried to compose my face into a mask of pleasant surprise, but I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. Not Jess's light tread, but a heavier, more deliberate sound. Liam. The doorknob turned. I held my breath. The door swung inward, and he stood there, silhouetted for a moment against the bright light of the hallway. He wasn't holding a briefcase or a gym bag. His hands were empty. He wasn't smiling. His eyes took in the scene in an instant, me standing frozen by the desk, the folder sitting in the inbox tray, the slightly too perfect arrangement of the items on his desk. A flicker of something cold and dark passed through his eyes. It wasn't shock, it was confirmation. "Looking for something, Carol?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. I turned, forcing a wobbly smile onto my face, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could see it moving the fabric of my blouse. I held up the small photograph. "Liam, you're back early. I wanted to leave this little surprise for Jess, right here on her desk where she'd see it." My voice sounded thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. The lie was so flimsy, so transparent, it felt like tissue paper trying to stop a flood. He didn't even glance at the photo. He walked slowly into the room, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick rug, and closed the door behind him with a quiet, definitive click. The sound sealed the room, turning it from an office into an interrogation chamber. He walked past me to the desk, his movements calm and precise. He didn't need to look in the folder. He didn't need to check the checkbook. He knew. He picked up the manila folder, weighed it in his hand for a moment, and then looked directly at me. The polite, charming mask he wore for the world was gone. What was left was pure, reptilian coldness. You know, he began tossing the folder back onto the desk with a soft thud. I told Jess this was a mistake, a surprise visit. I told her you were smarter than she gave you credit for. More resourceful. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to look up at him. But I have to admit, I'm disappointed. This is just clumsy, Carol. Desperate. I don't know what you're talking about, I whispered, but the words had no conviction. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Please, let's not insult each other's intelligence. You come all the way down here on your last dime, sneak into my private office, and start rummaging through my financial records. You're not here to cook a welcome home meal. You're here because you got it into your head that you're some kind of victim in a story you can't even begin to comprehend. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. So let me help you comprehend it. You have nothing. You are a cleaner from Cleveland with a past-due tax bill and a 10-year-old car. I am a man who has a team of lawyers on a $5,000 a month retainer just to handle parking tickets. You think you found something in that folder. A secret. You think you're holding a weapon. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was suffocating. What you've actually found, Carol, is a way to lose everything. I know about the tax notice. I know what you have in the bank. I know how close to the edge you really are. You push this, you make this a problem, and that edge will crumble underneath you so fast your head will spin. Your little house that your sainted husband worked so hard for? Gone. Your peace and quiet? Gone. We will bury you in legal motions and depositions until you can't remember your own name. And we will do it with a smile, telling the world we are simply trying to protect a beloved family member who has sadly become confused. He straightened up, his eyes boring into mine. You have a cracked phone in your pocket. I have the best law firm in the state of Texas. Do you really want to see how that math works out? He looked me up and down, a final, dismissive glance that stripped away the last of my dignity. Stop digging into things you can't possibly understand. Go home, be the quiet, grateful mother Jess tells everyone you are. It's a much better story for you. He turned and opened the door. Jess was standing in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared at the floor as Liam put a hand on my back, a gesture that wasn't comforting but proprietary, and steered me out of the office. I think your mother was just leaving, he said to his wife, his voice once again smooth as silk. I walked down the long, white hallway, through their cold, perfect house, and out the front door into the blinding Texas sun. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me. I walked down the long driveway, my legs shaking but somehow holding me up. My hand was clamped around the phone in my pocket, the sharp corner of it digging into my palm. He was right. I was a cleaner from Cleveland. And he was a powerful man with an army of lawyers. But he was wrong about one thing. I hadn't found a weapon. I had just become one. And he had no idea how sharp my edges had become. The flight back to Cleveland was a 5-hour eternity spent in a state of suspended shock. I sat crammed in a middle seat, the roar of the engines a dull hum in my ears, and felt the chill of Liam's threat clinging to me like a second skin. You have a cracked phone and a cleaning cart. He meant it as an insult, a final, dismissive summary of my life. He wanted those words to be a cage, to remind me of how small and powerless I was in his world of wealth and influence. But as the plane descended through the thick gray clouds that always seemed to hang over my city, I felt something shift inside me. He had given me a choice. I could either let his words be my epitaph, or I could turn them into my battle cry. Back in the quiet sanctuary of my own small apartment, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Liam's power came from the shadows. He thrived in private offices, in whispered threats, in legal documents filled with language designed to confuse and intimidate. He was counting on my silence. He was counting on my shame. He believed I would crawl back into my corner, too terrified of losing the little I had to fight for what was right. He had left me with no path for a private resolution. A quiet conversation was impossible. He had made it clear that any attempt to reason with them would be met with overwhelming legal force. So, if I couldn't fight him in the dark, on his terms, I would have to drag the entire thing into the light. The next night, on my break, I found Marco in the lobby. My hands were still shaking slightly as I pulled up a chair to his security desk. "Marco," I started, my voice lower than usual. "I need your help again. I need to tell a story, online, but I need to do it without anyone knowing it's me." He listened intently as I explained, not the whole story, but enough. I told him I was dealing with a powerful family member who was taking advantage of me, and that I was afraid of their lawyers. He didn't ask for details I wasn't offering. He just nodded, his young face serious. "You need a blog," he said simply. "An anonymous one. It's easy. We can set it up in 10 minutes. He walked me through the process, helping me choose a simple, untraceable username and a basic layout. When it came to the name of the blog, the title of my new, secret identity, the words came to me instantly. I typed them into the box, the Cleveland Cleaner. I was taking their insult and wearing it as a badge of honor. That weekend, I went back to the library. I sat at the same carrel, but this time, I wasn't a detective. I was a witness. I opened the blank blog post and began to write. The words didn't come easily at first. They were jagged and angry. I deleted the first draft, then the second. Finally, I just started telling the story as if I were talking to Brenda over a cup of coffee at Gus's. "My name is not important," I wrote. "What is important is that I am a 62-year-old woman in Ohio who has worked hard her entire life. Last month, my daughter, a successful CEO, stood on a stage and accepted an award for being an ethical innovator. She cried as she told the world she gives me a $10,000 a month stipend to honor my sacrifices. I was watching on a cracked phone screen. My dinner that night was a can of soup. The next day, I counted out coins to buy a loaf of bread. The stipend is not real, but the lie is. I wrote about the cold in my apartment, the fear of the tax notice, the condescending phone call where I was told I was confused. I didn't use their names. I called them the CEO and the strategist. I laid out the two realities, side by side, the glittering fantasy they performed for the world and the grim, exhausting truth I was living every single day. I wrote about the luxury condo bought with cash by a ghost company. I ended the post with a simple, direct question. What do you do when the people who are supposed to love you the most have turned your life into a lie for their own profit? My finger hovered over the publish button for a full minute. This was the point of no return. This was an act of war. I thought of Liam's cold eyes, of Jess's practiced tears, of my husband's house. I closed my eyes and clicked the button. For the first few hours, there was only silence. I felt a wave of despair, thinking my small voice had just vanished into the vast, noisy void of the internet. Then, the first comment appeared. It was from a woman in Florida. "My son does the same thing. He tells the family he pays my rent, but the check is always in the mail. Thank you for making me feel less alone." Another one followed, from a man in Arizona. "They called me confused and forgetful, too. It's their word for shut up. Stay strong." By the next morning, there were dozens. Then, over 100. Marco texted me a link. Someone had shared my post on a large online forum for caregivers. From there, it had been shared to a Facebook group for people dealing with toxic families, and then to a subreddit about financial abuse. It was spreading. The comments were a heartbreaking chorus of shared pain. People from all over the country were telling their own stories. Stories of being used as props, of financial deception wrapped in the language of love and care. They weren't just offering sympathy, they were offering validation. They saw me. They believed me. I sat there in the quiet library, tears streaming down my face as I read message after message. Liam had wanted me to feel isolated. He had wanted me to believe I was one lonely, confused old woman against his powerful empire. But he was wrong. I wasn't alone at all. I was a cleaner from Cleveland, yes. But I had just found my army. For 3 days, the comments section of the Cleveland Cleaner was my sanctuary. It was a small, flickering campfire in a world that had felt dark and cold, a place where the stories of strangers warmed me and made me feel seen. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since that horrible night of the gala, I wasn't afraid. I had my story, and now I had my witnesses. The silence from Austin was deafening. I knew they were aware of the blog. Marco had shown me how to look at the visitor analytics, and a steady stream of traffic was coming from a corporate server registered to Viridia. They were watching. They were waiting. I knew a storm was coming. I just didn't know what shape it would take. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't Liam's cold, sharp tone. It was Jess. and the frantic, high-pitched panic in her voice was a sound I hadn't heard since she was a teenager who had crashed her first car. "Mom, what have you done?" she shrieked without so much as a hello. "What is this website? People are sending it to my investors. It's all over the internal company chat. Do you have any idea the damage you're causing?" I sat down at my kitchen table, my back straight, and looked at the stack of printed evidence I now kept in a simple manila folder. "I told a story, Jessica," I said, my voice calm and even. "It seems to be a story a lot of people recognize. You have to take it down. Now," she demanded. "This is a nightmare. Liam is furious. You are ruining everything we've worked for over a childish misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," I said, and the certainty in my own voice felt like a rock. "And I'm not taking anything down. If you want to talk about this, you can do it here, in my home, in my reality." "Fine," she snapped, a cornered animal choosing to fight. "I'm on the next flight. We are going to fix the mess you've made." Then she hung up. "The mess you've made." The blame was still my burden, her last desperate attempt to control the narrative. But the panic in her voice told me everything I needed to know. The power was shifting. She arrived the next morning, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and barely suppressed rage. She stood in the doorway of my small apartment, dressed in a sleek, cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked utterly out of place, a glossy magazine ad dropped into a world of worn linoleum and second-hand furniture. She didn't hug me. She stalked into the living room, her hands clenched at her sides. "Okay," she said, pacing in front of the armchair Tom used to love. "This has to stop. I don't know what kind of fantasy you've cooked up in your head, but it is destroying my life. We will transfer $5,000 into your account right now. In exchange, you will take down the website, delete every post, and you will sign a simple non-disclosure agreement." It wasn't an apology. It was a business transaction, an offer of hush money. I let her finish, my heart a slow, steady beat in my chest. I watched the daughter I had raised, a woman who now saw her mother's pain as a public relations crisis to be managed, a problem to be solved with a wire transfer and a legal form. When she was done, I didn't say a word. I simply stood up, walked to the counter, and picked up my own manila folder. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd counted out coins for groceries, and opened it. I slid the first piece of paper across the table toward her. It was the business filing for LM Creative Holdings, LLC. "I know about the company, Jess," I said quietly. Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through her angry facade. She stared at the paper, as if it were a snake. I slid the next one across, the property record for the luxury condo. "I know about the apartment you bought with cash in Austin." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color was draining from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a mask on a porcelain doll. I continued, my voice never rising. I laid out the printed pages from the Travis County website, the photos of the river view, the assessment value of $1.8 million, and then came the final blow. I took out my phone and slid it across the table. The screen lit up with the photos I had taken in their office. "I know about the checks, honey," I said, my voice softening with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "The ones from your company, written to Liam's company." I saw the memo lines: family support, parental care. I swiped to the next photo, the accountant's letter. "And I know what your accountant calls me, an innovative elder care support strategy, a way to maximize your tax efficiency." Oh, Jessica stared at the phone screen, at the undeniable, photographic proof of her and Liam's meticulous crime. All the fight, all the blustering anger, vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. The fast-talking, award-winning CEO was gone. In her place was a pale, trembling woman who had been caught. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. All her money, all her lawyers, all her public relations spin were useless against the simple, brutal truth displayed on the screen of my cracked phone. She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, terrified plea. "Mom," she whispered, the words sounding fragile and broken. I met her gaze, and I felt no triumph, only a profound, aching sadness for the daughter I had lost. "The lies are over, Jessica," I said, my voice as solid and unmovable as the ground beneath my house. "This isn't about $5,000 and a gag order anymore. This is about the truth. I gave you your life. I will not let you steal mine." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray Cleveland street. You have a choice. You and Liam can start the process of making this right, the real, legal, documented process, or you can do nothing. I turned back to face her, a quiet cleaner in a small apartment, holding the entire future of an ethical innovator in my hands. And I will take this folder to the district attorney, and I will let the world watch your beautiful, ethical house of cards burn to the ground. Jessica left without another word. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. She simply gathered her composure, straightened the jacket of her impossibly expensive pantsuit, and walked out of my apartment, leaving the faint, cloying scent of her perfume hanging in the air. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the folder at the center of my kitchen table. There was no sense of victory, no triumphant satisfaction. There was only the cold, hollow ache of a final ending. I had won the confrontation, but I had lost my daughter. I sank into one of the worn kitchen chairs, the adrenaline draining out of me, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt the full weight of my grief and let myself weep. The tears weren't for the money, or the lies, or the house. They were for the little girl with scraped knees I used to carry on my hip, for the ambitious teenager whose college applications I'd helped her fill out at this very table. Somewhere along the way, that girl had vanished, replaced by the cold, terrified stranger who had just walked out of my life. After the tears subsided, a quiet, steely resolve took their place. My grief was real, but it couldn't be my guide. The path forward had to be paved with action, not sorrow. That night, I wrote a new post on the Cleveland Cleaner. I didn't recount the details of Jess's visit. I simply wrote, "When you finally have the proof in your hands, what do you do next? For those who have been down this road, what is the first step toward real justice?" The response was a tidal wave. The community I had found online rose up to meet me. The comments were a flood of practical advice, legal resources, and fierce encouragement. One name kept coming up, the North Ohio Center for Elder Justice, a legal aid society that worked on a sliding scale. One woman, a retired paralegal from Dayton, sent me a private message. "They are bulldogs," she wrote. "They will not let you be dismissed." By morning, someone had started a small online fundraiser to cover any initial legal fees, with the title, "Help the Cleveland Cleaner Get a Lawyer." It raised over $2,000 in less than a day. I sat at my computer, watching strangers and allies invest in my fight, and felt a sense of gratitude so profound it almost brought me to my knees again. Armed with this new courage, I made the call. A week later, I was sitting in a small, tidy office, across a simple wooden desk from a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She was a legal aid lawyer in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Brenda. I handed her my folder. For nearly an hour, she read in complete silence, her expression unreadable. She examined the LLC filing, the condo deed, and the photos of the checks and the accountant's letter on my phone. When she was finished, she carefully stacked the papers, folded her hands on top of them, and looked me squarely in the eye. "Carol," she said, her voice devoid of pity but filled with a powerful conviction. "This isn't a family misunderstanding. This is a textbook case of financial elder abuse, layered with potential wire fraud and tax evasion. You haven't just uncovered a lie, you've uncovered a criminal enterprise. Your evidence is meticulous. It's a prosecutor's dream. Hearing a lawyer, a professional, validate my reality in such stark, unequivocal terms felt like a steel rod being inserted into my spine. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't confused. I was a victim, and I had a case." Sarah explained the next steps. She would contact the district attorney's office in Travis County, Austin. She told me that the public nature of my blog, while risky, had created a public interest narrative that prosecutors might find compelling. "You've already done half their work for them, Carol," she said with a small, grim smile. "You've established a pattern of public deception before they even file a single paper." The next 2 weeks were a blur of official phone calls and scanned documents. The Travis County DA's office was interested, very interested. They scheduled a video conference. I sat in Sarah's office, staring into a webcam, and told my story again to an assistant district attorney, a serious-looking man whose expression never changed. He listened, asked a few pointed questions about the timeline, and thanked me for my courage. It all felt very distant and clinical until the call I received from Sarah a week later. I was at home, washing dishes, when the phone rang. "Carol, it's Sarah. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. I leaned against the counter, my heart beginning to pound. The DA's office just called. They presented the preliminary evidence to a judge this morning. The judge has signed off on multiple search warrants for Viridia's corporate headquarters and for Jessica and Liam Morgan's private residence. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white. What does that mean?" I whispered. "It means it's real, Carol," Sarah said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "It means the authorities are taking over. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's theirs." That night, I couldn't sit still. I paced my small apartment, a caged animal waiting for a storm to break. I turned on the news, the television's familiar chatter, a weak defense against the roaring in my own head. And then, it happened. A local news anchor cut to a breaking story. My breath caught in my throat. The screen wasn't showing a fire or a traffic jam in Cleveland. It was live footage from Austin, Texas. I saw the familiar glass facade of the Viridia building, but this time, there were official-looking black cars parked out front, their lights flashing silently in the twilight. Men and women in dark windbreakers with letters printed on the back were carrying boxes out of the front door. The headline at the bottom of the screen was stark and brutal. "Ethical tech firm raided. CEO under investigation for fraud, elder abuse." My story wasn't a secret blog post anymore. It was a national headline. The world was watching, and my daughter's beautiful, ethical house of cards was beginning to burn. The months between the raid and the trial were the strangest of my life. My quiet, invisible existence was over. Reporters occasionally camped out in my apartment hallway, and my face, captured in a grainy photo, was suddenly on websites I didn't know existed. But mostly, I was insulated from the storm. Sarah, my lawyer, was my shield. She handled the press with a firm, polite, no comment, and she and the team from the DA's office handled the legal preparations. My job, she told me, was simple: to rest, to stay steady, and to be ready to tell the truth one more time. The blog, the Cleveland Cleaner, fell silent. It had served its purpose. It had been a flare sent up in the dark, and the rescue party had arrived. The trial itself was a blur of legal procedure and high drama. I flew to Austin and sat in the cold, imposing courtroom every day, a quiet woman in a simple black dress, a ghost from a life my daughter had tried to erase. The prosecution, led by the serious-faced assistant DA, was methodical. They laid out my evidence piece by piece, building a wall of facts so high and so solid that it seemed impossible to breach. My printed-out blog posts were entered as Exhibit A, establishing a public pattern of deception. The checks to Liam's ghost company were Exhibits B through Z. The condo deed was the final, damning brick in the wall. Liam's defense was predictable. His expensive lawyers painted him as a brilliant but careless innovator, a man so focused on the big picture that he'd allowed clerical errors and aggressive accounting strategies to be misconstrued as malice. Jess's defense was even more heartbreaking. Her legal team tried to sever her from Liam, portraying her as the passionate visionary, the celebrated CEO who had been tragically deceived by a manipulative husband she had trusted implicitly. She cried on the stand, her tears just as perfect and practiced as they had been at the awards gala. The trial took a turn, however, when the prosecution brought in other witnesses. A man from Houston testified that Liam had convinced him to invest his retirement savings into a shell company years ago, a company that had dissolved 6 months later, taking his life savings with it. A former Viridia employee testified that Liam had created a system of special project funds that were in fact personal slush funds. It became clear that I wasn't the first person he had used. I was just the first one who had fought back with a map and a witness. My case wasn't an isolated family drama. It was just one chapter in his long, sordid history of fraud. When I finally took the stand, the room was utterly silent. I wasn't nervous. I had been telling this story to myself, to Brenda, and to the world for months. I simply looked at the 12 jurors, ordinary people who looked like they knew the value of $1, and I told them the truth. I spoke of the cold in my apartment, the fear of the tax notice, the sting of being called confused by my own child. When Liam's lawyer cross-examined me, asking if I was simply a bitter mother, resentful of her daughter's success, I looked him in the eye. "I have never been resentful of her success," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I was a proud mother, but I am resentful of having my life, my name, and my struggles used as a costume for a success that was built on lies." The jury was out for less than 5 hours. I sat with Sarah in a small, windowless waiting room, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. When the bailiff called us back in, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had done everything I could. I had told my story, the rest was out of my hands. We filed back into the courtroom. Jess was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Liam stared straight ahead, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. He cleared his throat. On the charge of felony financial elder abuse, we the jury find the defendant, Liam Morgan, guilty. A gasp went through the room. We find the defendant, Jessica Morgan, guilty. Jess let out a small, choked sob. He continued, his voice a steady, dispassionate drumbeat. Forgery, guilty. Wire fraud, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. On every single count for both of them, the word was the same, guilty. It wasn't a feeling of victory that washed over me. It was relief. A deep, profound, bone-weary relief. The weight I had been carrying for so long, the burden of being the sole keeper of a truth no one else would acknowledge, was finally lifted. I leaned forward and quietly put my head in my hands, not to cry but just to feel the solidness of the table beneath my palms. It was over. It was finally, truly over. Sarah put a steadying hand on my shoulder. As the room erupted into a chaos of hushed whispers and shuffling feet, I saw my daughter collapse into the arms of her lawyer, her perfect, composed facade shattering into a million pieces. Liam just sat there, a statue of a man, his empire of lies a pile of rubble at his feet. The ethical innovator of the year was a fraud, and the whole world now knew it. The world didn't stop turning after the verdict. The news cycle moved on, the cameras found new stories, and the quiet of my life slowly returned. The sentences came down a few weeks later. Liam received a significant prison term for his history of calculated fraud. Jessica, for her role, received a lesser, but still life-altering, sentence. There was no joy in it for me, only a deep, somber finality, like the closing of a heavy book. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to. My truth had already been told. A few months later, a check arrived in the mail. It was from the court, a first payment of the restitution they had been ordered to pay. I looked at the number, at the string of zeros that had once seemed so alien and impossible. It wasn't winning the lottery. It felt more like an apology from the universe. The first thing I did was walk down to the county treasurer's office. I stood at the same counter where I had once pleaded for an extension and paid the full delinquent balance on my property taxes. As the clerk stamped my receipt paid in full, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. The house was safe. Tom's legacy was safe. But as the weeks went on, I found that safety wasn't enough. I thought of the hundreds of comments on my blog, the emails from strangers who had seen their own silent struggles in my story. Their voices stayed with me. My name had been used to create a false legacy, a lie told on a stage for applause. I decided then that I would use the rest of my life, and the resources I now had, to build a real one. With the help of Sarah and a very enthusiastic Brenda, I started a small foundation. We called it the Legacy Project. It was small, local, and focused on doing two simple things. First, we hosted free workshops in libraries and community centers, teaching seniors how to read their bank statements, how to spot the red flags of financial abuse, and how to understand the confusing language of investments and LLCs. Second, we created a fund to connect people who couldn't afford it with lawyers like Sarah, bulldogs who would fight for them. Marco, my first ally, designed our simple website and managed our online presence, making sure our message reached the people who needed it most. Our first workshop was in the basement of a church on the west side. The room smelled like stale coffee and old hymn books. 15 people showed up, their faces a roadmap of worry and hope. I stood before them, not as a victim, not as a viral sensation, but as Carol Sullivan, a retired nurse's aide from Cleveland. I told them my story, and then I listened to theirs. And in that small, humble room, I finally understood. A legacy isn't a number announced into a microphone. It isn't a glass award or a headline in the news. It's the quiet, unseen work of one person reaching out to another and saying, "You are not confused, you are not alone, and you will not be silent anymore." My life hadn't been stolen from me. It had been given a new, unexpected purpose. The pain had been forged into a key, and now I was spending my days helping other people unlock their own doors. I had found my peace, not in their downfall, but in the quiet, steady work of building something real and true in the ashes of their lives.